There was blood in his boot and a mile of dark road behind him, and the Duke of Oakhaven had just decided he was going to die in a ditch like a broken horse when he saw the light in the cottage window and someone opened the door before he could fall. He did not, of course, look like a duke. That was the whole of the accident and the making of everything that came after. Gideon, Duke of Oakhaven, had ridden out 3 days before to see his northern acres for himself, not through an agent's ledger but with his own eyes in a plain riding coat, telling no one who he was, because he had grown weary of being shown only what men wished a duke to see. He had wanted for once the truth of his own country. He got rather more of it than he bargained for. On the second night his horse had gone lame. On the third, crossing a stretch of lonely fell in a failing light. The beast had shied at something in the bracken and thrown him hard against a stone wall, and gone off into the dusk, and left him with a gash along his brow that would stop bleeding, a wrenched knee, and no notion where he was. He had walked. There was nothing else to do. He had walked until the light failed altogether, and the cold came down off the fell like a closing hand, in a good coat now stiff with his own blood, a great and wealthy man reduced in an evening to exactly what he looked like, a hurt and penniless-seeming traveller, of no consequence whatever. On a road where his name and his rank and his 40,000 a year were worth precisely nothing, because no one knew them. It was a novel condition. He had time in the cold dark to reflect that he had spent his whole life being valued for things that a wall and a shying horse could strip from him in an instant, and that he did not much like what was left, and did not know it very well. Then the light. Then the low door of a poor cottage set back from the road, and a young woman opening it with a rushlight in her hand, peering out at the sound of him stumbling, and her quick indrawn breath at the sight of a bleeding stranger swaying in her doorway. "Oh, mercy," she said. Come in before you fall. Lean on me. There. Sit you down." She was a servant. He could see that much, even half fainting, a maid-of-all-work by her rough clean apron and her reddened working hands, a girl of perhaps 23 with a plain honest face and dark hair escaping its pins, in a cottage that held one room and a loft and not much else. She got him to the settle by the fire with an arm under his that was far stronger than it looked, and she did not ask his name or his business or whether he could pay, which were the 3 things every other soul in his life had always wanted first. She looked at the blood on his brow and the way he held his knee and said only, "You're hurt bad. Sit still. Let me see to it." And she saw to it. He watched her, drifting in and out of the pain, and what he saw he would remember to the end of his life. She had almost nothing. He could take the inventory of her whole world in a glance. A scrub table, 2 stools, a shelf of a few crocks, a fire built small to spare the fuel, a single loaf and the end of a cheese that were plainly meant to last her the week. And out of that almost nothing she gave to him, a stranger, without a heartbeat's hesitation, the best of everything she had. She heated water and bathed the gash on his brow with a cloth torn from a clean shift, her touch as careful as if he were made of glass. She bound it. She got his boot off the wrenched knee and bound that too and propped it, and never once winced at the blood on her floor or her apron. And then she cut him bread, from the loaf that was her whole week's bread, and warmed milk in a pan and crumbled the good cheese into it and set it before him, and said, "Slow now. You've lost blood and you're chilled to the bone. You'll mend faster with something hot in you." "This is your supper," he said. His voice came out rough. He had understood, watching her cut the loaf, exactly what she was doing, exactly what it cost. "Your week's bread. I cannot take a poor woman's week of bread." She looked at him, surprised, as if the arithmetic he was doing had genuinely not occurred to her. "It's a hurt man's supper tonight," she said simply, "and I'll manage. I always manage. Eat it while it's hot, sir, and don't fret about my bread. Bread's bread." A body left to bleed on a cold fell is a graver thing than a lean week, and she turned back to the fire and left him no room to argue, and the Duke of Oakhaven, who had dined off gold plate and refused richer suppers than this out of mere idleness, ate a poor maid's whole week of bread and cheese and warm milk in a 1-room cottage, and could not afterward remember anything in his life that had tasted half so good, or shamed him half so deeply, or moved him at all in the way this did. Her name was Nell Harrow, and he learned it that night, and much else, because a man mending by a poor woman's fire has nothing to do but talk, and she was easy to talk to in the way that only entirely unguarded people are. She was maid-of-all-work to a hard farmer's family a half-mile off, she told him, and had the cottage as part of her wage, because it was too tumble-down for anyone else to want and stood on the edge of their land. Her parents were dead. She had no people. She rose before light and worked till after dark and was paid little and thanked less, and she said all of it without a scrap of complaint, as a person reports the weather, and then she asked about him, not who he was, but whether his head pained him, whether he was warm enough, whether he had folk who would worry, and he found, to his own surprise, that he lied to her and hated the lie even as he told it. Gideon, he said, when she asked his name, which was true, and a steward's man riding on my master's business, which was not, and he watched her accept it without suspicion, this open trusting creature, and felt the falseness of it sit in him like a swallowed stone. He was not, in the ordinary run of things, a man troubled by the small dishonesties that oiled a great man's life. He found he was troubled by lying to Nell Harrow. It was a new sensation and he did not care for it. She gave him the settle by the fire and the one good blanket, and climbed to her cold loft without a murmur over his protest, saying a hurt man needed the warmth, and she was used to the loft, and there was an end of it. He lay awake a long while in the low red light of the banked fire, in the small warm poverty of her house, and listened to the fell wind go over the roof, and thought about a great many things he had never before had cause to think about, chief among them, that in 33 years of being flattered and served and courted for his rank and his fortune, no one, not one soul, had ever given him anything at real cost to themselves, expecting nothing, not even knowing there was anything to be got. Everyone who had ever been kind to Oakhaven had been kind to the Duke. This woman had been kind to a bleeding stranger who could not pay her, and whom she would likely never see again, out of nothing but the plain habit of her own good heart. It undid something in him that he had not known was fastened. He stayed 2 days. He could not have walked far on the knee in any case, and she would not hear of him trying, and the truth was he did not want to go. He mended by her fire and watched her live her hard, small life, and helped where his hurt would let him, mending the broken hinge of her door with his own hands, which he had never in his life used for labor and found he was clumsy at and oddly proud of, splitting what kindling he could sitting down, and talking, always talking in the evenings, more truthfully than he had ever talked to anyone, except for the one great lie of who he was, which grew heavier by the hour. He learned that she read, taught by a dead mother, and hungered for it, and had 3 books to her name and knew them nearly by heart. He learned that she sang under her breath at her work, low, unaware she did it. He learned that she was clever, quick and shrewd and observant, wasted entirely on a life of scrubbing another family's floors, and that she was funny dryly when she forgot to be humble, and that her laugh, when he surprised it out of her, was the best sound he had heard in years. He learned that she was lonely, though she would never have used the word, and that she had folded the loneliness away small and got on with things, the way she got on with everything. And he learned, on the 2nd evening, watching her by the firelight bent over one of her 3 books with her lips moving silently at the harder words, that he had fallen in love with a poor maid-of-all-work in a tumble-down cottage on a fell. He, the Duke of Oakhaven, who had refused a decade of the finest and best-dowered women in the kingdom out of a boredom he had taken for discernment, and that it was the truest thing that had ever happened to him, and that he had built it upon a lie, and that when she learned the lie, as she must, it might undo everything. On the 3rd morning his knee would bear him, and a passing carter could be hailed on the road to carry him toward the town, where he could send for his own people, and he could not in decency stay longer. He stood in her doorway in the pale light with his mended coat and his bound brow, and Nell Harrow gave him the last of her bread wrapped in a clean cloth for the road, over his refusal, and he looked at her open, honest face, and very nearly told her everything. He did not. He was afraid to. He told himself he would come back and tell her properly, when he could do it with something to offer and not merely a confession. But the truth, which he was only beginning to be honest enough to see, was that he was a coward about exactly one thing in the world. And it was the good opinion of Nell Harrow, and he could not bear to watch it change when she learned what he was. "I have no way to repay you," he said, which was the largest lie of all, from a man with 40,000 a year. "There's naught to repay," she said. "You'd have done the same," She said it as a simple certainty, as though the whole world were made of people who would take in a bleeding stranger and give him their week of bread. Because that was the world she lived in and could not imagine another. Go careful, Gideon. Mind that knee. And, a little shy this, if ever you're on the fell road again, the kettle's always warm. He took her reddened working hand and held it a moment longer than he ought, and then the carter's wheels sounded on the road and he went. The second morning of his stay, he woke to find her already gone to her work at the farm before light, with the fire banked and a bowl of porridge left keeping warm for him at the edge of the hearth and a scrap of paper beside it, on which she had written, in a careful, laborious hand, "Back at dusk, rest the knee." And he sat holding the little paper for a long while with an ache in his chest he could not account for. No one had ever left the Duke of Oakhaven a note. His household anticipated his wants. His agents reported to him. His acquaintances flattered him. But no one had ever, in the whole of his gilded life, gone off to a hard day's labor before dawn and stopped, in the dark, to write 4 crooked words so that a stranger by her fire would not wake alone and wonder if he had been forgotten. It was such a small thing. It was the largest thing anyone had ever done for him. He did not rest the knee. He could not sit still in her house being cared for and give nothing back. It was not in him, or rather, he was discovering freshly at 33 that it was in him, and had only never been asked of him before. So he spent the day doing what a hurt man could. The door had hung crooked on a broken hinge and let the fell wind in. He took it off its pins, and with her few poor tools and his own soft, unpracticed hands he mended it, badly at first and then better, and hung it true, and stood back sweeting and absurdly pleased with a thing any labourer could have done in half the time. He swept her hearth. He set her 3 books straight on their shelf, and opening one, found her name written inside the cover in the same careful hand, Nell Harrow, her book, with the her book underlined twice, as though to hold fast against a world that had let her keep so little. He closed it gently and did not tell her he had seen. When she came home in the last of the light, footsore and grey with tiredness, and saw the mended door swing true and shut out the wind for the first time in a year, she stopped in the doorway and stared at it, and then at him. And her tired face did a complicated thing, and she said, gruffly to hide it, "You'll have set that knee back, you great fool," and turned quickly to the fire so he would not see her eyes. He saw them anyway. He said nothing. He had learned in 2 days that the poor guard their gratitude as fiercely as their pride, being so seldom given anything to be grateful for, and that the kindest thing was to let her hide it. That evening was the best of the 3, and the one he carried longest. She was too tired to keep up her careful humility, and so she forgot it, and became simply herself, quick and dry and clever, telling him the small comedies of the farmhouse, mimicking the farmer's wife's airs until he laughed aloud, arguing with him about a thing in one of her 3 books with a shrewdness that would not have disgraced a scholar. He watched her across the small firelit room, this woman with nothing, more alive and more herself than any glittering creature he had ever partnered at a ball, and he understood, quietly and completely, that he was lost. That whatever came of it, whatever it cost, this was the only face at the only fireside he would ever want, and he opened his mouth to tell her the truth of who he was, then and there, and lost his nerve and closed it, and hated himself, and let the lie stand one night more. He meant to come back within the week. It was 6 weeks before he could, and every day of it he thought of her. He had ridden home to Oakhaven, to the great house with its 40 rooms and its 100 servants, and its acres running to the horizon. All of it suddenly and permanently altered in his eyes, because he had spent 2 days in a 1-room cottage and could no longer see his own wealth without seeing, beside it, a poor woman cutting her week's bread for a stranger. He set his stewards to a quiet task first, to find out who held the land the Harrow cottage stood on, and how Nell Harrow was used, and whether the hard farming family that paid her little and thanked her less might be spoken to. What he learned did not please him. She was worked cruelly and paid a pittance and lived, as he had seen, on the edge of want, 1 bad season from nothing, and had borne it for years without complaint, because there was nowhere else for a maid with no people to go. He could have mended it all with a stroke of a pen and never seen her again, and for a day or 2 he told himself that was the honourable course, to be her secret benefactor, to lift her burden and vanish, and let her never know. It was the sort of clean, distant, painless generosity a great man could perform without cost to his comfort. And he found, thinking of her open face across the firelight, that he could not bear it. He did not want to be her secret benefactor. He wanted to be at her fire. He wanted her laugh, surprised of her every evening for the rest of his life. He, who had refused the whole marriage market of the kingdom, wanted to marry a maid-of-all-work who read her 3 books by rushlight and did not know he was a duke. So he did not send an agent. He did not send money in an envelope. 6 weeks after he had left, on a fine autumn afternoon with the fell all gold and rust, the Duke of Oakhaven rode up the road to Nell Harrow's cottage himself. But he came as himself this time, in the clothes of his rank, on a fine horse, with the plain truth ready at last on his tongue, and a fear in his chest such as no ballroom full of heiresses had ever put there. She was in the little courtyard beside the cottage when he came, and she straightened at the sound of the horse and pushed the hair from her face with the back of a wrist, and he saw the moment she knew him, the bound brow healed now to a pale scar, the same grey eyes, and the glad astonished smile that broke over her face. "Gideon, you came back." And then he saw that smile falter and fail as she took in the rest of him, the horse worth more than her cottage, the coat, the bearing, the unmistakable, unhideable fact of what he was. She had opened her mouth to greet a steward's man come back to the fell road and closed it, and stood very still with her reddened hands at her sides, and the colour went out of her face. "You're not a steward's man," she said. "Lo, not a question, no," he said. He had rehearsed 100 graceful speeches on the ride and forgot every one of them. He got down off the horse so as not to loom, and stood before her in the gold light with his heart going like a hammer. "No, I am not. I lied to you, and I have hated the lie every day since, and I have come to unsay it and to ask you to forgive it. I am Gideon, that much was true. But I am Gideon, Duke of Oakhaven. This is my land you stand on. It was my acres I was riding to see in a plain coat the night my horse threw me at your wall. And you, not knowing, wanting nothing, thinking me a hurt stranger who could never pay you back, you gave me a week of bread and your fire and your one good blanket, and you climbed to a cold loft so a bleeding nobody could sleep warm. Do you understand what that was? In 33 years of being flattered by everyone who ever wanted something from my rank, no living soul had ever once been kind to me for nothing. You are the only person I have ever known who was kind to the man and not the duke, because you did not know there was a duke. And I have not had a peaceful hour since, for thinking of you." Nell Harrow had gone from white to a deep, painful red, and a chin had come up, and there was hurt in her face and something harder under it, pride, the pride of the poor that is the last thing they own and the fiercest. "You let me feed you my bread," she said, and her voice shook, "and lie awake worrying you'd folk to fret for you, and you a duke that could buy my whole life 100 times over. You let me pity you. You made a fool of me, sir, in my own house, and now you come in your fine coat to what? To laugh, to pay me off like I was an inn?" he said, and he took a step toward her, urgent now. "God, no, never that. Nell, I let you feed me because I could not bear to break the one true thing that had ever happened to me. It was cowardice, and it was wrong, and I am sorry for it with my whole heart. But hear me, I did not come to pay you. I came because I have been in 40 rooms of my own great house these 6 weeks, and every one of them was empty, and the only warm place in the whole world I could think of was a one-room cottage on a cold fell, where a woman with nothing gave me everything. I came because I love you. I have loved you since the second night, since I watched you spell out the hard words in your book by the firelight, and knew I had never in my life met anyone I would rather sit beside. I am not offering you money, Nell Harrow. I am offering you my name and my hand, and every acre and every empty room and myself, which is worth the least of all of it and is yours regardless. I am asking you to marry me. The 6 weeks he could not come to her were not idle weeks, though they felt to him like a slow torment. He went back to his life and found it unwearable. He sat at the head of his long table in the great echoing dining room and could not taste the 6 courses for thinking of bread and cheese and warm milk by rushlight. He walked his 40 rooms and heard his own footsteps and thought of one room where a woman sang under her breath at her work. He went once to a grand assembly at a neighbouring seat, because his sister pressed him, and stood among the silks and the candlelight and the practised laughter, and was so plainly, coldly wretched that his sister asked him what in the world had come over him. He did not tell her. He looked at the glittering room full of people who wanted his rank, and he thought of a crooked note that said "Rest the knee," and he left early. But there were things that had to be done, and could only be done slowly and in secret, and he did them. He would not go to Nell Harrow and lift her out of her hard life by force of his money, like a man buying a thing he fancied. That would have been to do to her exactly what he most despised, to make her a possession purchased. But neither could he leave her worked cruelly for a pittance 1 week longer than he must. So, quietly, through a lawyer who did not know the whole of it, he bought out the hard farmer's lease and interest in the strip of land the cottage stood on, so that Nell Harrow's home, at least, could never be taken from her whatever else befell. And he arranged, without her knowing, that if she would not have him, if he came in his true colors and she sent him away in her pride, she would nonetheless be provided for to the end of her days, comfortably, out of an anonymous trust. And never know from whom. He set that in place first, before ever he rode north. He wanted, whatever answer she gave, for her never again to lie one bad season from want. It was the only part of his fortune that had ever given him real joy to spend, and he spent it not knowing if he would ever be thanked, which was, he understood, the whole point, and the very thing she had taught him, cutting her week's bread for a stranger who could give nothing back. And when all of it was settled, so that his coming to her could be an offer of the heart and not a purchase, and so that her refusal, if it came, would leave her safe, only then did he put on the clothes of his rank and take his best horse, and ride north up the fell road toward the one warm window in the world, with the truth ready at last on his tongue and terror in his heart. She would not, that first day, let him lift her onto the fine horse and carry her off like a prize. She was too shaken and too proud, and there was too much to be said. So instead, the Duke of Oakhaven did a thing that scandalized his groom and delighted him. He tied his valuable horse to Nell Harrow's courtyard fence, and went into her one-room cottage, and sat down on the same settle where she had bound his brow, and asked if the kettle was still warm. It was. She made him tea with hands that had not quite stopped trembling, and set it before him in the same chipped crock he had drunk from as a bleeding stranger, and then she sat down on her stool across the little scrubbed table. And for a long time the two of them simply looked at one another in the gold afternoon light, a duke and a maid-of-all-work, taking the measure of the enormous thing that had come into the small room. "I have to be sure of you," she said at last low. "Not of your money, of you. You lied to me once, Gideon, for 2 whole days, and I never guessed, which means I don't know you as well as I thought I did, and that frightens me more than the coronet. So before I say yes to any of it, before I let myself, I have to know that the man who mended my door is the true one, and the Duke is the coat, and not the other way about. Ask me anything," he said. "I will not lie to you again as long as I live. I swear it on the only sacred thing I own, which is a wooden platter and a square of cloth that I have carried in my breast pocket these 6 weeks like a fool, because they are the last things you gave me, and I could not leave them behind." And he took them out. The worn platter would not fit, but the folded cloth was there, over his heart, and laid the cloth on her table between them, creased and clean, and Nell Harrow looked at it, and put her hand over her mouth, and knew. They talked until the light failed, and he answered everything, plainly, the whole truth of his cold gilded life and the way she had cracked it open, and by the time the first star showed over the fell, the fright had gone out of her face, and something steadier and warmer had taken its place. She walked him out to his horse in the blue dusk, and at the fence, before he mounted, she reached up of her own accord and touched the pale scar on his brow, where she had once bound the blood, very gently, with her reddened working fingers. "It healed well," she said. "You healed it well," he said, and covered her hand with his own and held it against his face a moment in the dark. And that, though the wedding was still weeks off and the whole scandalized kingdom still to be faced, was the moment the Duke of Oakhaven counted afterward as the true beginning of his life. A poor maid's hand against his scarred brow in the blue fell dusk, given freely, wanting nothing, exactly as she had given everything the first night at her door, to a stranger who could give nothing back. The silence on the fell was very large. Somewhere a curlew called and fell quiet. Nell Harrow stood in her courtyard with her mouth pressed hard and her eyes bright, and Gideon, Duke of Oakhaven, waited on the answer of a maid-of-all-work with more terror than he had ever felt in his life. "You cannot marry me," she said at last, and it came out not as refusal but as grief, which was worse. "Whatever you feel, whatever I know, dukes do not marry maids, Gideon. You would be a scandal. They would laugh at you in every fine house in the kingdom, and cut you, and say the Duke of Oakhaven had lost his wits over a scullery girl, and I would be the ruin of you, and you would come to hate me for it in time, when the shine wore off. I have no dowry and no people and no manners for your rooms, and I would shame you at every turn, and I love you far too well." She stopped, having said it, having let it out at last, and pressed her hand to her mouth. "I love you far too well," she said again, more quietly, "to do that to you. So no, thank you. But no, go home and marry a lady and be happy, and let me keep 2 days by the fire, for they were the finest of my life, and I'll not spoil them by ruining you after." And the Duke of Oakhaven, hearing a poor woman refuse 40,000 a year and a coronet out of love for him, out of care for his good, felt the last of the old distant discerning boredom burn entirely away, and knew he would move heaven and earth before he let her go. "Let them laugh," he said. He came the last of the distance to her, and took both her reddened working hands in his gently, and she let him. "Let every fine house in the kingdom cut me. I have sat in those houses for 30 years, Nell, and been bored to my bones, and been alone in the middle of 200 people who wanted my rank, and none of whom would have given me their week of bread. I do not want their good opinion. I have discovered it is worth nothing. I want yours, which is worth everything, and I have it, and you have just proved it past all doubt, for a scheming girl would have snatched at the coronet, and you tried to give it back to me to save me. That is why I will marry you and no other, not in spite of what you are, because of it. As for manners and rooms, you are the cleverest woman I have ever met, and you learn to read by rushlight off 3 books. You will have my whole library and any master you like, and you will outshine every lady in the county within a 12-month, and I shall enjoy watching you do it. As for a dowry, I have enough fortune for 40 brides, and no use for any of it that would please me half so well as making yours. And as for ruining me," his voice went low and rough, "Nell, I was ruined already. A rich, cold, lonely man is a ruin, whatever the ledgers say, and I did not even know it until a poor woman on a fell showed me what a warm life looked like, and then sent me back to my cold one. Do not send me back. I am asking you to save me a second time. You saved my body at your door with your week of bread. Save the rest of me now. Marry me, and let me spend the whole of my fortune and my life learning to be worth the woman who gave everything to a stranger who could give nothing back." Nell Harrow looked up at him, and the tears she had been holding spilled over at last, and she made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh, the laugh he loved, surprised out of her even now. "You are a very stubborn man," she said, "for a duke." "I am told it is my worst quality," he agreed. "Is that a yes?" "It is a—" She shook her head, helpless, undone. "It is a yes, God help us both, it is a yes, though I still say you're mad and they'll laugh at you, and I don't know a fish fork from a hay fork. Yes, yes, Gideon. If you're truly not afraid of it, then neither am I, for I've been afraid of everything my whole life, and I'm tired of it. Yes." He reeled, a whole boyish laugh, the first and longer than he could remember, and gathered her up off the fell into his arms. This woman with nothing who had given him everything, and held her while the autumn light poured gold over the fell, and the curlew called again, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying. They were married before the winter, at the little grey church in the dale below the fell, and the fine houses of the kingdom did indeed talk, at length scandalized and delighted, the Duke of Oakhaven and his scullery maid Duchess, and Gideon did not care in the least, and Nell learned very quickly to care even less, for she found, once she was over the fright of it, that she had a great gift for looking a sneering countess dead in the eye, and being perfectly, warmly, immovably herself, which unsettled the countesses far more than any grand manner could have. Within the year, as he had promised, she outshone them, not by aping their polish, but by being the one genuinely kind person in every room, and people who came to laugh at the Duke's odd choice went away, against their will, rather in love with his Duchess. He gave her the library. She read her way through it like a woman let into a garden after a life in a cell, and argued with him about it in the evenings, dryly, funnily, and he counted those evenings the wealth of his life. He gave her the mending of the estate's poor. And she did it with a shrewd, unsentimental competence that no lady-born duchess could have matched, because she had been poor herself and knew exactly where a pound would do good and where it would only be pocketed. And the tenants of Oakhaven came to bless the day the Duke's horse threw him at a fell wall, and in a place of honour on the wall of the great warm drawing-room, where they sat of an evening, framed like a treasure, hung a plain thing that puzzled every grand visitor who saw it, an old wooden platter, worn smooth, and a rushlight holder of common iron, and a small square of clean coarse cloth, the very cloth she had wrapped his last bread in. To remind me, the Duke of Oakhaven would say, when anyone asked. And he would look across the firelit room at his Duchess bent over a book with her lips moving silently at the harder words, exactly as she had the night he fell in love with her. Of what I was worth the night I had nothing, and who it was that fed me anyway. Everything I have twice over now, but that platter is the only thing in this house I would run into the fire to save. And Nell would look up and catch his eye across the warm room, and the laugh he loved would break over her face, surprised out of her still after all the years. And the great house that had echoed empty for 30 years was empty no longer, and never was again.